Continue working on your project. You can also open the file named crown.05 if you need to catch up. You now have all you need to export your project to 3ds Max Design. You have a 3D surface of the terrain, a corridor representing the bridge, and an alignment to be used as a centerline. Exporting to 3ds Max Design could potentially be achieved using regular methods, namely using FBX output or Suite's workflow. However, to take advantage of Civil View and what it has to offer, you'd want to export the project in a VSSP 3D format. This format is particularly suited to work in tandem with the Civil View plugin. To export a Civil 3D project using the VSSP 3D format, use the Output tab. You have many output options, including one for 3ds Max Design. When you click this button, and after a few moments of computing, you are presented with a dialog where you can choose items to be exported. In this case, you certainly need the corridor you created and the terrain surface you copied and simplified. You don't necessarily need the original high detailed surface named crown point EG, so you can safely uncheck that. Once you click the Export button, you are prompted for a file name. Note the VSSP 3D extension. The default file name is the same as its Civil 3D counterpart. Give it a different name, as the crown.05.vsp3d file is already provided to you. Export the file. Again, it will take a few moments for the save feature to compute. Close the dialog when done. You are now ready to import the file in 3ds Max Design. If you want, you can even close Civil 3D at this point. Start 3ds Max Design. Use Customize Units Setup to ensure that both system units and display units are set to meters. For good measure, reset the scene as well. It's usually a safe thing to do after defining units. Note the Civil View pull-down menu. This is the plugin that makes working with Civil 3D data a real blast. Although it is optimized for Civil 3D data, you can still use it simply with regular 3ds Max components. Note that it is part of the 3D Max Design interface, but you won't find it in plain old 3ds Max. At this point, there's only one item in the menu. Go ahead and choose it. Start Civil View. The very first time you start Civil View, you are presented with an initialization dialog. Once you choose your defaults, this dialog will not appear again. You would still be able to make changes to these settings in a different dialog, as you will learn in a second. The first part of the dialog relates to system units. Leave it in meters, as it is the units we agreed to work with from the beginning. The second section relates to the Country Resource Kit. A resource kit assembles a collection of assets such as cars, trees, and other objects that you can add to your scene. It's an extensive library, and you want to choose one that fits your project. In this case, choose the US Metric Resource Kit. You will learn shortly how you can also use a private kit if you don't want to mess with the existing ones. Finally, the third option asks if you'd rather have Civil View start automatically with every session of 3ds Max Design. I prefer to keep it on demand, but feel free to use your own preference in this case. Click OK to dismiss the dialog. Civil View runs, and the pull-down now shows more options. If you need to access these settings again, you can do so under Civil View Preferences. There's the option for automatic starts, and there's the option for resource kits. Note the section that states that you can use private kits as well. You'll be revisiting this section shortly. Dismiss the dialog. Now you take a look at importing the file you saved in Civil 3D. Choose Civil View, Geometry Import, Civil 3D VSSP 3D file. a dialog appears. Click Open and select the file you saved earlier, or you can point to the file named crown.05 VSP3D that you downloaded for this tutorial. A multitude of components that you can import are now listed in the dialog. Not all of them are relevant to your work. In fact, in the spirit of keeping the scene manageable, you will only choose those few components that you really need. For example, you certainly need the CVCP-EG surface representing the terrain, so go ahead and put a check mark next to it. You also need the corridor surfaces labeled Region 1, Region 2, and Region 3. These represent the three parts of the bridge, the end parts, Regions 1 and 3, and the part over the water, Region 2. These surfaces represent the 3D geometry that you eventually render, but you can also make use of splines coming from Civil 3D. For example, take note of the very first entry listed as a corridor baseline. This is the original centerline alignment that you drew, and you will be using it extensively to place objects along the bridge. Make sure this option is checked. There are quite a few objects listed as feature lines. Again, these are all splines that you can use in a variety of ways. For example, there are 6 sidewalks feature lines that run along the inside and the outside of the sidewalks defined in the scene. Enable the sidewalk out feature line that runs along Region 2. Region 2 is the section of the bridge above the water. You will need that option later when you learn about swept objects. You can experiment importing additional feature lines, but the 6 components currently selected should be enough for this project. Click OK to accept the inputs. A dialog appears prompting you for something called a global shift. Because the Civil 3D data is geolocated, it is far from the 000 origin point. It is not an issue with Civil 3D, but it can be an issue with 3ds Max. 3ds Max doesn't like it very much when the geometry is far from the origin, and precision suffers in that respect. So this message is suggesting that all geometry is shifted closer to the origin. Go ahead and click Yes. Another warning suggests that you use feature interpretation styles at import time. This is a bit premature as you haven't learned yet about Civil View styles, so simply click Yes to dismiss the dialog. After a few moments of computing, the Civil 3D scene is imported into 3ds Max Design. For now, the surface appears checkered, but we'll get to that in a moment. Choose Civil View, Civil View, Civil View Explorer. A floater appears. Go ahead and dock it to the left. This is a special Explorer type that enables you to edit components imported or created in Civil View. Select the ground surface. Notice that even though it was simplified in Civil 3D, it is still fairly detailed. In fact, it is so detailed it is a little hard to see. You may want to change the display of the viewport to visualize it better. Click the little plus sign and choose Configure Viewports. Enable selection brackets and disable Display Selected with Etched Faces. This was the default a few 3ds Max versions back. Click OK. The terrain is a bit easier to see now, especially if and when you apply a texture to it. Speaking of which, Civil View makes that process easy without having to deal with the material editor. With the terrain selected and recognized in Civil View Explorer, click the Draping tab. Click the Choose Bitmap button and select the aerial image picture that you saved earlier in the tutorial and that you named crown.eg.jpg. Click Yes to display the image on the terrain. If you haven't saved an aerial image, then the provided crown.eg JPEG file is just a raw representation of the land, water, and a few major roads. It doesn't look as good as a proper satellite image, so I encourage you to create your own as shown earlier in this tutorial. As long as the aerial image is cropped to match the extents of the terrain, it will be projected perfectly. Save your file. In the next movie, you continue with some basic scene setup.